Hello, Com 103 students. This is the final exam study guide video. We're going to be going over the content from the second half of the semester, clarifying any information and defining some terms for you. It's chapters 12, 13, 14, 16, 17, and 18. Please note that the final is cumulative, so you'll see some questions from the content from the first half of the semester, so it'll be helpful to look back at your notes, maybe look back at the midterm study guide video, and just make sure you're prepared for that content from earlier in the semester. That said, this video is all about going through those 6 chapters that we covered since midterm and defining some terms and clarifying some information. Feel free to use this to take notes, and hopefully this will help you be better prepared to be successful on the final. So let's jump right into chapter 12. Chapter 12 was all about effective use of language, so we start off the chapter by defining a couple of key terms. What is a language? What is a word? Languages are essentially verbal codes, but more specifically, a language is a verbal code made up of symbols that communities use to share ideas and reflect culture. Now, languages are made up of words. What is a word? A word is simply a name that we give cultural memories or things significant enough to name. That's how we define a word. Now, words have multiple types of meanings. The denotative meaning of a word is the dictionary definition of the word. Or if we jump down to right here, the connotative meaning of a word is the emotional overtones associated with that word. Now, there's a couple sub-points here. An ambiguous word is a word that has more than one meaning, and it relies on the context to understand which meaning is being used. So think of the word range, vocal range, mountain range, oven range, the range between two distances. It depends on the context in which it's being used to know which range is appropriate. Jargon. Jargon is specialized or technical words that are used to serve special groups or cultures of people. Once again, the connotative meaning of a word is the emotional overtones associated with that word. So sometimes words have, associations that go along with them. Epithets. Epithets are typically negative connotations. These describe some quality of a person or group, often with negative connotations attached. While euphemisms are simply a way that we substitute more acceptable or inoffensive terms for something that might be considered offensive or less acceptable, or just something that somebody feels uncomfortable saying. So you might say kick the bucket rather than talking about death, and that's a simple example of a euphemism. Vivid language. There are 3 specific examples of ways that you can use vivid language. These are very appropriate for use in something like the tribute speech, where effective language and creative language needs to be used. So alliteration. Alliteration is words that begin with the same sound. So, a sentence like he swiftly and smoothly stole second base has a lot of S words in it, and it kind of rolls off the tongue. Alliteration can be used very effectively. Rhymes are words that end with the same sound, and this can also be very effective in something like a commemorative speech. A metaphor is an implied comparison. Okay? We wrap up chapter 12 talking about powerful, powerless, and inclusive language. So powerful language is simply straightforward, direct, and to the point, while powerless language uses things that we want to avoid if at all possible: hedges, tag questions, and disclaimers. So a few examples of what you might say if you were using hedges, tag questions, or disclaimers, things you want to avoid. A hedge would be something like saying sort of or kind of in your speech. A tag question would be like making a statement but then following up with "isn't it?" That question to the audience. And a disclaimer would be saying something like "I'm pretty sure" after sharing a statistic. We want to avoid those if at all possible. And then finally, inclusive language simply means that you're avoiding racist, sexist, ageist, and non-parallel language in your speaking. Okay, moving on to chapter 13. Chapter 13 was about design. There's just a few things I want you to know from this chapter for the final. First off, what is dual processing? And then the 4 general design principles. So dual processing simply means hearing and seeing at the same time. And another thing to note is that it's said that dual processing creates better retention. So if people can learn by hearing and seeing at the same time, they're more likely to retain that information better. Then the general design principles. There's 4 of them: simplicity, repetition, contrast, and space. Simplicity means one idea per visual. Repetition means using the same fonts, colors throughout. Contrast means adding visual interest with color and formatting. And space means dividing your slide up and organizing the slide appropriately. This is also where you would utilize the rule of thirds. Okay, chapter 14. All you need to know from chapter 14 is these 4 types of delivery and the differences between them. So manuscript delivery is reading the speech word for word from a script. This is essentially a scripted delivery. Memorized delivery is what it sounds like. You are reading the script or reading the speech from memory. It's kind of like a scripted speech. You're not reading it off of a piece of paper, but you're regurgitating it as you have it memorized in your head. So a lot of times these sound a bit unnatural and don't have that nice smooth flow that something like an extemporaneous speech might have. Impromptu speaking. This is a speech that is done with little preparation beforehand. So the main thing to note is that in an impromptu speech, you have to rely on prior knowledge and previous experience. And then finally, extemporaneous speaking. This is the most common type, and this is the type that we strive for in COM 103. Extemporaneous means carefully planned in advance, prepared and practiced, but not scripted. The specific wording is chosen within the speech itself. So the speech might sound just a little bit different every time you give it, while the main content would stay the same. Okay, moving on to chapter 16 and 17. These 2 chapters deal with persuasion and persuasive speaking. So at the start of chapter 16, we define a couple of terms, rhetoric and persuasion. So what is rhetoric? Rhetoric is simply the art of persuasion. There's another definition for it from another chapter that defines it as using communication to achieve specific goals. But we can also define it here as the art of persuasion. Also be able to define persuasion itself. So what is persuasion? Persuasion is a symbolic process in which a communicator creates a message in an attempt to convince others to change their attitudes or behaviors. So once again, persuasion is a symbolic process in which a communicator creates a message in an attempt to convince others to change their attitudes or behaviors. We spent, the chapter 16 spends a lot of time on Aristotle's 3 modes of persuasion. These are kind of the 3 key elements that work together to make a speaker very persuasive. So ethos, pathos, and logos. Starting with ethos. Ethos is speaker credibility. And there's multiple kind of elements that go into a speaker being seen as credible. Good character is the first. Good character means sticking by your convictions and holding true to your beliefs even if they're not popular. Goodwill means finding common ground with your audience. Good sense means using intelligence and sound reasoning. And dynamism is using energy and enthusiasm in your delivery. Pathos is the second mode of persuasion, and this is what we call emotional proofs or appeals to emotion. And these can be very persuasive and are used all the time in persuasive speaking. So we can appeal to positive emotions, we can appeal to negative emotions, we can appeal to needs. So positive emotions, you could appeal to love, peace, unity, freedom, etc. Negative emotions, you could appeal to fear, hate, anger, and people use these all the time to try to convince people to come along with their ideas. And finally, you can appeal to needs, things like shelter, food, security, etc. And finally, the third mode of persuasion is logos. Logos is rational proofs. This is the verbal arguments you're making that relate to your subject. So this includes the use of figurative analogies, literal analogies, inductive and deductive reasoning, and causal or cause and effect reasoning. So a figurative analogy is simply a metaphor. Okay, it compares two dissimilar things and finds a recognizable similarity. So it's finding a common link between two otherwise unsimilar things. While a literal analogy is what we call parallel case reasoning, and this is where you're simply comparing the likeness between two similar things. You're arguing that what happened in one is likely to happen in the other because they're so similar. Okay? Inductive versus deductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning is reasoning that begins with specific instances or examples and then applies those to a premise or a generalization. Okay, so you're presenting multiple instances and examples, and then you apply those to your claim that you're making. Deductive reasoning simply goes in the other direction. Okay, so when you're reasoning deductively, you start with the premise or the generalization, and then you use specific instances and examples to prove that claim that you're trying to make. Finally, causal reasoning is simply cause and effect reasoning, and it's basically saying that the second would not exist without the first. Okay? All right, moving on to fallacies. Fallacies are one of those kind of being able to recognize fallacies is a life skill. Okay, beyond public speaking, beyond learning to be an effective public speaker, this is something that will help you be a more knowledgeable consumer of media and news. It'll help you come to conclusions more effectively. It will help you see through faulty reasoning that people might have that are making claims to you. All right, so a fallacy is a mistake in reasoning. There's lots of fallacies out there. However, the ones you need to know for the final are these 8 that were covered in chapter 16. So let's take a look at them. An unsupported assertion. This is simply a claim that's being made without any evidence to back it up. Right? Second, the ad populum fallacy, also known as the bandwagon effect. This is essentially the fallacy that says because everybody believes it's true, it is. And obviously this is not the case. Popular opinion does not necessarily make something true or right. Ad hominem, the third fallacy. This is the personal attack fallacy, used all the time in politics. The idea is you're attacking the messenger and trying to discredit them as a person while ignoring the actual argument that's being made. So demeaning the messenger, ignoring the argument. False analogy is the fourth. This compares two things that aren't similar enough to warrant the conclusion being drawn. So you're simply making an analogy when it's not warranted. The similarities aren't close enough. Faulty generalization. This is an inductive fallacy. So once again, if you're using inductive reasoning, you're sharing examples and instances and then coming to a conclusion or a generalization based on those. And in a faulty generalization, you're simply drawing conclusions from too few instances. You might take one random example and then apply that to some large claim that you're making, and you're going to need more proof and more examples to back up those claims. The sixth fallacy, slippery slope. This is stating without proof that when one thing happens, a snowball or a domino effect of massive proportion will happen after the fact. Okay, and once again, politicians use this all the time to try to get people to not support certain legislation, etc. Post hoc, ergo propter hoc, means after this, therefore because of this. This is the fallacy of causation, or the cause and effect fallacy. And finally, false dichotomy. This sets up an either-or choice without presenting other reasonable possibilities. So it says it's either this or that, and there's no other options. And a lot of times there are other options. Okay, wrapping up chapter 16 with invitational rhetoric. Equality is recognizing the importance of the audience. Non-hierarchical value of all means the speaker respects the listeners as equals. And self-determination means emphasizing the principle of choice, making it clear to the audience that it's up to them whether they're persuaded or not, or whether they change their beliefs or take action based on your speech. All right, we'll come back with a part 2 and wrap it up with chapter 17 and 18.